Margaret Thompson had lived in Brooksville for all of her 63 years. A quiet, unassuming woman, she never made a fuss, never demanded special treatment, and never raised her voice. She wore the same navy cardigan most days, always carried a neat handbag, and always greeted others with a warm smile. She wasn't wealthy in appearance or lifestyle, but she had lived wisely, saving carefully, investing patiently, and planning for every chapter of her life. Nobody in Brooksville ever suspected that Margaret Thompson was, in fact, one of the wealthiest individuals in the county. On a warm Tuesday morning, Margaret walked into her local branch of Middleton Bank, just a few blocks from her modest home. She needed to withdraw $5,000 in cash to help cover some urgent home renovations and assist her neighbor with medical bills. She waited patiently in line and eventually stepped up to the teller, a young woman named Jessica who had only recently been hired. Margaret politely requested her withdrawal, sliding over her ID and bank card. Jessica glanced at the request, raised an eyebrow, and said with a hint of skepticism, "Are you sure about this amount, ma'am?" Margaret smiled and nodded. "Yes, dear. I need it today." Jessica hesitated. She typed something into her computer, frowned, and then leaned toward Margaret. "I'm sorry, but I can't authorize this withdrawal. You'll need to speak with the branch manager." Margaret looked confused. "But this is my account. I've had it here for over 30 years. There's more than enough balance." Jessica shrugged apologetically and pointed her toward a glass-walled office. "Manager's orders. You'll need to get approval." Margaret, slightly unsettled but still polite, walked over and knocked on the door. Inside sat a man in his mid-40s named Daniel Granger, the newly appointed branch manager. He barely looked up as she entered. "I was told I need to get approval to withdraw some of my own money," Margaret said gently. Granger glanced at her ID and then back at his screen. "Yes, I see your account here. But we don't usually allow withdrawals of that size without prior notice. It's a security thing. We'll need to verify a few things before we can proceed." Margaret frowned. "I've never had to do this before. I don't understand the problem." Granger smirked slightly. "With all due respect, ma'am, it's standard policy. We have to be cautious. Large cash withdrawals from accounts like yours," he added, eyeing her worn cardigan and weathered handbag. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "So, you're denying my request?" Granger shrugged. "It's not a denial. It's a delay. Come back in a few days and we can arrange it." Margaret gave a tight smile. "Very well," she said softly. "Please don't bother. I'll make a few calls instead." She left without another word, stepped outside, pulled out her phone, and called the head office, a number very few people even had access to. Because Margaret Thompson wasn't just a customer. She was the primary shareholder in Middleton Bank, having quietly amassed shares over the past 20 years through a trust under her late husband's estate. She had never flexed her influence, never meddled in operations, but today, she had decided enough was enough. Within 7 minutes, the regional director, Charles Whitmore, was on the phone with Daniel Granger. The call was brief and brutal. "You just humiliated our majority stakeholder," Whitmore said. "Pack your things. You're done. Effective immediately." Granger stammered. "Stakeholder? That old woman." "That lady," Whitmore interrupted, "owns more of this bank than you can dream of. And you treated her like a fraud. Get out of the building before I have security escort you." Meanwhile, Margaret was already halfway down the block, sipping her tea from the cafe next door. The sky was blue, the breeze was gentle, and she felt no anger, only resolve. She didn't like making scenes, but today, she had reminded everyone that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. By the end of the day, every employee at the branch had been instructed to undergo retraining. A formal apology was issued, and a new manager, handpicked by Margaret herself, was appointed, someone known not for arrogance, but for compassion. And Margaret? She returned to her quiet life, her home, her garden, and her books. But the town never forgot the day a simple woman walked into a bank and walked out having fired the man who dared underestimate her. The following week, The air around Brooksville buzzed with murmurs and whispers about Margaret Thompson. For decades, she had been seen merely as a sweet widow who lived quietly, volunteered at the library, and brought warm apple pies to every neighborhood gathering. But after the incident at Middleton Bank, people began looking at her with newfound curiosity and awe. She hadn't sought attention. She hadn't told her story. But stories have a way of traveling, especially when silence is more deafening than words. Reporters tried knocking at her door. One even posed as a utility worker, but Margaret was sharper than she looked. She politely declined interviews, only offering a single statement: dignity costs nothing. But when taken away, it must be restored, not with fury, but with truth. Behind the scenes, Margaret had no interest in punishing the bank or seeking revenge. What she did care about, though, was transformation. She called an emergency board meeting, the first she had ever requested in 20 years. The board members, mostly men in tailored suits who had never once considered her more than a ceremonial seat holder, were startled by the tone of her message. "I've watched this bank lose its heart," she said, standing tall in front of the long, mahogany table. "When I first invested in Middleton, it was a community bank. It was built on trust. Now it behaves like a fortress, walls too high, policies too cold. This ends now." One board member cleared his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, if I may, we've grown with the times. We follow modern financial protocols." She cut in, still calm but firm. "If modern protocols demand we strip dignity from our customers, then they are broken, and they will be rewritten." Then came her proposal, radical to some, revolutionary to others, a full customer-first initiative, including personalized service, mandatory empathy training, and local community boards in every branch. But more than that, she proposed a new hiring strategy. Not just those with degrees in finance, but people with backgrounds in education, caregiving, community outreach. People who understood people. The board was stunned into silence. But Margaret was not there for their applause. She left the meeting after laying down her vision and left it to the votes. Within 48 hours, the results came back, unanimous approval. Every member knew that crossing Margaret now was not just unwise, it was unethical. She had set a new moral compass for Middleton Bank, and the board had no choice but to follow. Meanwhile, back at the Brooksville branch, a woman named Anita Alvarez took over as branch manager. A former school principal with no prior experience in banking, she had spent her life managing not money, but lives, guiding students, mentoring teachers, handling crises with compassion and logic. Margaret had chosen her not for her resume, but for her record of kindness. And within weeks, the branch transformed. Jessica, the teller who had first denied Margaret, was not fired. Margaret had made that clear. Instead, she was mentored. Anita took her under her wing, teaching her how to read not just policies but people. Slowly, Jessica began to change. She started greeting customers by name, learning their stories, and finding joy in her work. She even started a Community Moments board where anyone could post celebrations, photos, or kind messages. Word of Margaret's story reached beyond Brooksville. Other banks started calling Middleton for advice. Financial blogs wrote articles titled "The Woman Who Changed Banking with a Smile." Conferences requested her as a keynote speaker, all of which she politely declined. "The only audience I care for is the one in my garden," she would say, watering her roses. "They listen quietly, bloom fully, and never interrupt." But not all eyes on her were kind. In the shadows of the financial world, executives who thrived on automation and cost-cutting began whispering her name with irritation. Some saw her as a threat to efficiency, to profit margins, to the cold precision they worshipped. One conglomerate even proposed a hostile takeover of Middleton Bank, hoping to strip away the reforms and turn it into just another digit-driven institution. When Margaret heard of it, she smiled. "They want to take my bank?" she asked, sipping her tea. "Let them try. But before they get through the front doors, they'll have to pass through every grandmother, every schoolteacher, every farmer and nurse who now calls that bank theirs." And she wasn't wrong. The takeover attempt sparked a community revolt. Customers across dozens of branches threatened to pull their funds. Former employees came out with public support. A viral video, filmed by a local teenager, showed Margaret standing on the steps of the Brooksville branch saying, "This bank doesn't belong to a boardroom. It belongs to the people who built it, believe in it, and protect it. You don't buy trust. You earn it. Every day." Within 72 hours, the hostile bid collapsed, and Margaret, once again, returned to her quiet life. Or tried to, because something had shifted in her. She saw how small actions rippled into big changes. She realized how many people had been waiting for anyone, to remind them that decency wasn't outdated, that courage didn't always roar, and that even in finance, the soul could still have a seat at the table. So she started writing. Not for newspapers or blogs, but letters to mayors, to school boards, to business owners, to young women who had been told they were too soft for leadership. Letters filled with stories, wisdom, and a challenge. Be kind. Be strong. Be unshakable. And if you ever must raise your voice, do it not to shout, but to lift. And so the story of Margaret Thompson continued, not as a headline, but as a movement, quietly changing the world, one decision at a time. Months passed, and the ripple of Margaret Thompson's quiet revolution extended far beyond Brooksville. What had begun as a personal moment of dignity reclaimed had now become a beacon across counties, inspiring not just financial institutions, but entire communities to reevaluate how they treated their people. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about respect, integrity, and remembering that behind every transaction stood a living, breathing human being. Margaret, ever humble, never claimed to be a leader. She always said, "I'm just an old woman with a stubborn sense of what's right." But that stubbornness had awakened something deep within others. Letters began flooding her mailbox, not fan mail, but real, heartfelt messages. A single mother in Kansas wrote about how her local bank started offering financial literacy classes for free. A high school senior from Oregon shared how he used Margaret's story in a debate competition on ethical leadership and won. A former prison inmate wrote that after seeing her speech online, he decided to start a community fund for others leaving incarceration to help them start fresh. Margaret read every letter. She cried with some. She smiled at others. And she saved them all, stacked in neat piles in the old cedar chest her late husband had built in their first year of marriage. But behind her modesty, she began to plan again. One afternoon, she invited Anita, the new branch manager, and a few trusted friends from the town council over for tea. They sat in her cozy sunroom, the light filtering through lace curtains, the air warm with the scent of fresh-baked scones. "We've seen what one change can do," she began, folding her hands. "Now imagine what 10 changes could do. Or 100. What are you thinking?" Anita asked, already sensing that familiar spark in Margaret's voice. "I want to start a foundation," Margaret said. "Not for profit, not for glory, but to fund kindness. Practical kindness." She explained her vision, a network of community advocates in every town, trained individuals not bound to political or corporate interests, whose only job was to listen, mediate, uplift, and act. People who could help the elderly with paperwork, mediate disputes before they became lawsuits, organize town cleanups, tutor children, check on neighbors during snowstorms. A return to a society of watchers, not surveillance, but guardianship. A return to care. And so the Thompson Foundation for Everyday Dignity was born. Within a year, it had branches in 6 towns, then 20. It didn't advertise. It didn't chase followers. It simply showed up where it was needed. Each branch was run by locals for locals. Grants were small but immediate. No complicated applications, no 10-page essays, just a conversation in need and action. Meanwhile, Margaret's quiet influence kept growing. Universities asked to include her story in leadership courses. A publishing house offered her a 7-figure book deal, which she refused with a chuckle. "Why charge for something I'd rather give away?" she said, instead compiling her letters and speeches into a free downloadable PDF titled The Quiet Revolution. But not everyone celebrated her vision. Behind polished walls and polished smiles Large corporate banks began feeling the pressure. People were closing accounts, moving to community institutions, demanding transparency. Executives whispered her name like a storm on the horizon. They hired PR firms to reshape their image, launched shallow, customer-first campaigns, and yet, none of it stuck.
Why?
Because they were trying to imitate something they didn't understand. Margaret's revolution wasn't a brand. It was a belief. One particularly bold CEO, Stanley Wexler of Titan Global Finance, decided he would confront the issue head-on. He invited Margaret to speak at their leadership summit in New York City, assuming that either she'd refuse or falter under the spotlight of corporate scrutiny. She accepted. The summit was held in a skyscraper that scraped the clouds. Executives sat in tailored suits with tight smiles, some already prepared to laugh off her words as sentimental fluff. Margaret stepped onto the stage, wearing her navy cardigan and her late husband's locket. No script. No PowerPoint. Just presence. "I don't come here to shame," she began, "but to remind. Business is not built on numbers. It's built on need. If you forget the people behind the need, you forget the reason your business exists at all." She paused. The room was still. Efficiency without empathy is erosion. Profit without purpose is poison. But care is currency you cannot counterfeit. By the end of her speech, the room stood. Not because they were told to, but because some part of them, long buried under years of metrics and margins, had remembered. When she returned to Brooksville, she was greeted not with fanfare but something better. A quiet welcome home, her porch lit with candles, her garden weeded by neighbors, and a new bench installed outside the bank with a plaque that read, "Sit here and remember. Dignity belongs to all." Still, Margaret wasn't finished. Her next plan involved schools. She partnered with retired teachers to develop Compassion Curriculum, a non-graded module taught weekly in middle schools and high schools. Lessons on listening, kindness, conflict resolution, inclusion, and service. Pilots began in a few towns, but the results were staggering. Drops in bullying, increases in attendance, even academic improvements as emotional well-being rose. And as the foundation grew, it began to draw unexpected allies, former CEOs, athletes, artists, even government officials who had long grown disillusioned with their own power. They didn't want a spotlight. They wanted purpose. Margaret welcomed them, not as saviors, but as citizens. And all the while, in her little house with the squeaky gate and the bird feeder out front, Margaret kept going. She rose with the sun, brewed her tea, answered letters, mentored young people, and tended to her roses. She never claimed to be more than a woman who cared deeply and acted when it mattered. But the world had begun to change, not with noise, but with steady, quiet resolve. And so the story continues, not with endings, but with echoes. Because somewhere in another town, another person is being told they're too small to make a difference. And somewhere, someone else is remembering the woman who once walked into a bank, was denied her own money, and walked out not with revenge, but with revolution. The seasons shifted, and Brooksville bloomed with more than just spring flowers. It had become a symbol, not a tourist spot, not a landmark, but a living, breathing testament to what community meant when every heartbeat counted. Yet while Margaret remained the soul of this transformation, she had never intended to be the center. She believed deeply in legacy, not in monuments or medals, but in people. And now, the seeds she had planted were bearing fruit in places she'd never even set foot. One morning, Margaret received a small, wrinkled envelope in the mail, addressed in careful, almost childlike handwriting. Inside was a note written by a 14-year-old girl named Layla from a refugee settlement in southern Europe. The note read, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, my teacher told us your story. We don't have banks like yours. But I shared your story with the elders in our camp. Now, every Friday we sit together, talk about what's bothering us, and decide together how to fix it. The neighbors who used to argue now share bread. I don't know if this is what you wanted, but I hope it is. We call it the Friday table.
Love."
Layla. Margaret wept quietly in her garden that day. Not out of sadness, but because she knew this was it. The change was no longer hers. It had traveled on its own, finding homes in the hearts of strangers, in languages she didn't speak, in places she might never see. So she leaned into it. The Thompson Foundation began reaching further, not through glossy expansion plans or expensive campaigns, but through letters, through people, through purpose. They created a program called Roots, connecting elders with youths from different parts of the world through handwritten letters, stories, recipes, songs, and traditions. Margaret believed that healing came not from power, but from shared memory. Meanwhile, back at Brooksville, something else was happening. Jessica, the same teller who had once turned Margaret away, had risen in responsibility. She'd completed her business degree at night, mentored by Anita and Margaret both. But she had also grown in empathy. She was now working with formerly incarcerated women, helping them learn financial literacy and giving them second chances through employment at her newly established community credit union. She named it Open Hands Financial. When asked what inspired her, she always smiled and said, "A woman once gave me the chance to grow when she had every right to shut me out. I just want to keep that chain unbroken." And still, the winds of resistance blew elsewhere. One multinational corporation, Laxwell Holdings, known for its aggressive acquisitions and deep lobbying roots, began targeting small-town banks that followed the Thompson model. They bought out community lenders, replaced staff with AI kiosks, and removed personal service in favor of algorithms. One town after another reported losses, not just in finances, but in morale, in spirit. It was a slow erosion. When Margaret heard of this, she didn't panic. She sent one letter, addressed to the CEO of Laxwell Holdings. Typed, not handwritten, not poetic, not angry, just one sentence. The farther you move from your people, the shorter your tower becomes. No signature, no return address. But the letter went viral after a young employee, disillusioned by the takeover, leaked it online. It was shared millions of times. #ShorterTower trended across platforms. And suddenly, Margaret's quiet voice was louder than any ad campaign. The backlash against Laxwell was swift. Investors fled. Communities pulled out. Leaders resigned. And through it all, Margaret said nothing publicly. Because she wasn't there to win. She was there to witness the world remembering itself. Then came the day Margaret fell ill. The town held its breath. She was not invincible, and she never claimed to be. Just an old woman with a vision. As she rested in her home, surrounded by letters and flowers from every corner of the world, people gathered outside silently each evening. Not in protest, not in mourning, but in solidarity. They brought candles,
Guitars.
children painted signs that said things like "Kindness lives here" and "Thank you for reminding us." Doctors said her health might never fully return. But Margaret, ever the quiet storm, smiled and whispered, "Then let them take the torch." And they did. Jessica, Anita, Layla, Tariq from Morocco, Nadia from Detroit, Gus from Argentina. Thousands. Then tens of thousands. People began creating their own Friday tables, their own open hands banks, their own Thompson circles. And none of them claimed ownership. They only passed it on. And Margaret, now often resting by her window with a cup of chamomile tea, watched the sunset one evening and whispered to herself, "I wasn't the story. I was only the spark." And far, far beyond the borders of Brooksville, in cities loud and silent, among towers tall and villages small, the quiet revolution rolled on, not as noise, not as war, but as water. Steady,
Sure.
unstoppable. Years passed. Margaret Thompson, now nearing her centennial year, no longer moved through the world as swiftly as she once had, but the world moved through her. Her name had transcended generations, not as a symbol of power or rebellion, but as a whisper of memory, a living reminder that kindness had once taken root and refused to die. The Thompson Foundation had grown into something far beyond its founder. With offices in over 40 countries, chapters in schools, rural villages, correctional centers, and even aboard naval ships, it became not just a foundation, but a quiet movement woven into the very language of care. There was no leader, No hierarchy, only a guiding principle: people before process. Always. In the Brazilian Amazon, a tiny village once torn by conflict now held monthly gatherings where grievances were aired and resolved through dialogue, a model inspired by a single faded photocopy of Margaret's first letter. In a Tokyo high school, every student in their final year was required to mentor a younger peer, and they called it the Thompson year. In an inner-city neighborhood in Johannesburg, a woman named Mfo turned her small home into a kitchen where anyone could eat without question. On her wall hung a photo of Margaret, not as a saint, but as a friend. "She taught me not to ask permission to care," Mfo would say, "only to begin." Meanwhile, in Brooksville, the little town where it all began, nothing and everything had changed. The streets still curved the same, the bakery still smelled like warm sugar at dawn, and children still played near the old willow tree by the bank. But the spirit had deepened. The bank itself, once just a financial institution, had transformed into a community epicenter. The vault room now hosted town storytelling nights. The old boardroom served as a daycare on weekdays and a conflict mediation space on weekends. Its motto, etched in the glass entrance in gold script, read, "Account with us and count on us." Margaret no longer attended the board meetings, but her chair remained at the table, empty and waiting, out of reverence, not nostalgia. Yet as the world embraced her vision, new challenges emerged. In the age of artificial intelligence and automation, governments began experimenting with social systems entirely managed by algorithms: welfare, healthcare, justice. On paper, it was efficient, but in practice, people were getting lost between data points. That's when the world turned again to Margaret's legacy. A global summit was convened in Geneva, not by the United Nations or the World Bank, but by a spontaneous coalition of teachers, midwives, artists, social workers, and teenagers. It was unofficial, unfunded, and unstoppable. They called it the Common Thread Gathering, a meeting of those who believed society should be stitched with intention and care. Margaret, too frail to travel, was asked to send a message. Her granddaughter, Lily, now a young woman with her grandmother's fire and her own quiet voice, stood on the summit's final day and read from a letter written in shaky but deliberate handwriting. To those still listening, I never asked for following, only for remembering. Remember that systems are servants, not masters. That numbers measure value, but never define it. That a voice, no matter how small, can hold the power to steady or shatter a world. If you build with care, what you build will care for you. I was never the answer.
You are.
Margaret. The letter was met with silence, not the absence of sound, but the fullness of it. The kind of silence that holds breath and meaning at once. After that day, the Common Thread Gathering became an annual event, moving from country to country, held in churches and train stations, community halls and old barns, wherever people were willing to sit in a circle and begin. And so, Margaret's story passed into something sacred, not history, but inheritance. Children read her story as part of school books. Elders told it as parable. Her letters, compiled and translated into over 70 languages, were passed around like family heirlooms. Not because they were rare, but because they were real. Eventually, Margaret passed quietly, in the early morning light, her hand wrapped around Lily's, her other hand resting on the worn, leather-bound notebook where she had written her final thoughts. The world did not erupt in noise. There were no state funerals or televised tributes. Instead, something more extraordinary happened. All across the globe, for 1 hour on the day of her passing, people turned off their phones. Shops closed. Schools paused. Radios fell silent. And in that silence, people remembered. They sat together, told stories, helped strangers, forgave old wounds, and simply cared. Not in Margaret's name, but in her spirit. The bench outside the bank in Brooksville now bore new words, engraved beneath the old. Don't build statues. Build better people. And the story, the one that began with a simple woman denied her own money, became a song sung not with lyrics but with lives. It was told again and again, not always perfectly, Not always in her words, but always with her heart. Because movements don't die. Stories don't end. And Margaret? She was never finished.